Hey, hello everyone and good afternoon. This is Mike Aaron from GRM, and we'd like to welcome you all to today's webinar. The topic for today is enabling the digital workplace, and our presenter is Jim Leonard. By way of introduction, Jim's a former CIO of several mid-sized healthcare organizations and presently consults with a variety of GRM healthcare clients, some of which are publicly held organizations and are among the largest in the healthcare industry. Now, before we get started, just one piece of housekeeping. During the course of the webinar, if you have a question, please use the Q&A icon in your toolbar, and we'll attempt to get through all questions, time permitting, after Jim's finished with his presentation. So thank you again for joining us, and without further delay, I'm going to hand things over to Jim.
Thanks, Mike, and welcome to everyone attending the webinar. I appreciate your time, taking the time out of your day to attend with us. This webinar is focused on our interpretation of the digital workplace. In this case, with a specific focus on healthcare institutions. I do understand that some non-healthcare related folks signed up for the webinar, so welcome to you folks as well. This will also be valuable to those organizations that support healthcare clients with some level of outsourcing of their daily operations like coding or billing activities. So what exactly is the digital workplace? Well, the digital workplace is a systematized interpretation of manual work processes that occur many times a day, a week, or a month. For this session, we'll term each individual time a work process is started as an instance of that work process. So each invoice that gets processed or each expense report that is submitted is an instance of these two drastically different work processes. As mentioned, each instance of a process involves some sort of content, an invoice, an expense report, etc. In the digital workplace, that content can be a scanned image, an office document, or an interface message, among many other types. Within the digital workplace, that content format is irrelevant. The data within that content is what's important. In this new paradigm, the digital workplace itself understands several important aspects of each instance, such as 1, the important or target data within that content. 2, how that content needs to be processed within the organization. This is the workflow. 3, the staff and the departments that are involved in that workflow process. 4, it needs to understand, is there a uniqueness to the data in a process instance that requires a subtle modification to the workflow of this particular instance. 5, the key performance indicators associated with this work process. And 6, how oversight of this process and its staff interactions is performed. All of this is understood by the digital workplace itself. As a hospital CIO in a number of organizations in my past, my insight into the digital workplace began way back in 1999. But before we get too far into the digital workplace, let me introduce GRM to those of you who may not know us. So GRM is the largest privately held information management company in the country. We have operations in 15 US cities, multiple international locations, and we currently service more than 7,000 clients nationwide. But by far, healthcare is GRM's #1 vertical market. Now you can see, based on the map, how our organizations do not specifically cover the entire United States. So we are ourselves users of the digital workplace so that we can manage clients and manage employees throughout the country, whether or not they exist in a particular office. I myself am a remote person in Nashville, Tennessee, and we have remote people throughout the country. All of us using activities within GRM's own digital workplace. It's important also to note that GRM is a leading enterprise content management provider. We call it our Enterprise Content Services Platform. It's been recognized by both Gartner and Forrester for a number of years. So let's get on into the actual discussion about the digital workplace. Enough about GRM as itself. So let's talk a bit about the components of the digital workplace. The digital mailroom typically stands somewhat apart from the concept and components of what is traditionally the digital workplace. But considering the current environment with many people working from home that used to work in an office, I felt it was important to review the idea of a digital mailroom as well. GRM has been supporting and promoting clients' progress towards the digital workplace for more than 5 years now, so we're quite well versed in the concept as well as the implementation of the components necessary for success in the digital workplace. The first of these components is advanced capture. This is how the digital workplace understands the data within each instance, and for that matter, which work process this content belongs to. The workflow associated with the process is, at its most basic level, who needs to interact with this content, and in what order do they need to interact with that content. Intelligent forms are used to present the important data elements that were extracted from the original content and how it's presented to users involved in the process. The intelligent form also carries a link to the original content in many cases. Artificial intelligence and machine learning are a relatively recent addition to the tool set of the digital workplace. We've been using AI and machine learning for about 1.5 years now within our solutions for clients. And it allows the digital workplace the ability to automatically adapt to previously unseen data, unknown formats, other content, and other unknowns that may be submitted to a work process. The analytics ties the whole package together, providing visibility into individual and aggregated instances of the work products. Analytics delivers the accountability aspect of the digital workplace. So the benefits of the digital workplace are as varied as the individual work processes that it delivers. The data and content involved in the process can only be accessed by members of the workflow involved. So we have a great deal of security wrapped around the idea of work processes delivered within the digital workplace. That's not to say the content cannot be shared, but while it's within the work process, content security is assured. Compare this to a current process that you may have with various content emailed to staff. There's absolutely no control over what that individual does with that content that they receive via email. It's also quite common, some of us may have had this experience ourselves, for staff to incorrectly address email messages and have your potentially sensitive content delivered to an unattended addressee. I myself, working with many clients across the country, probably 5 to 6 times a month, I'm actually delivered via email some content from someone that didn't really mean to address me in the process. And on very narrow occasions, it's some sensitive content that really would not be intended for me. Workflow definitions are built within the digital workplace, and automation is followed with each instance. The workflow engine is flexible enough to allow for variations in workflow based on data extracted from the content. Business rules and policy requirements are among the factors involved in sophisticated workflow design. Paper is removed from the process, as is reliance on email and the sharing of office documents once that work process is moved into the digital workplace. Efficiencies are delivered via both automated workflow and work queues for staff involved in that workflow. On occasion, we will generate email alerts for staff who only occasionally are involved in the workflow or whose main job function is outside the workflow, such as a CFO who may need to approve a high dollar amount purchase requisition. Another example of these business rules that are integrated into the digital workplace. Each individual instance in a work process can be viewed by those in the workflow, providing complete transparency into where that instance currently sits in the work process. For instance, which person or group's queue that instance currently resides, or its completion status. So we have complete visibility into any process that is generated within the digital workplace. In each step of the workflow process, time and date tags are captured so that aggregated analytics can be run against the entire work process. Which brings us to accountability. Since we track each instance through each step in the workflow with time and date stamps, accountability is ensured, and such reports can be used to mentor staff or have details available for annual review processes. Now let's dive into each component individually of the digital workplace. The digital mailroom. So here's a graphic representation of the digital mailroom. Again, this is not traditionally a component of the digital workplace, but considering the current state of the industry, I felt it was an important topic to cover today. So one of the problems when users are sent to remote locations or working from home, that type of thing, we lose that connection to mail coming into the organization, right? So GRM offers this solution for implementing a digital mailroom to have your mail forwarded to GRM or picked up by a GRM location. That mail gets opened, sorted, prepared, it's scanned, and a PDF of each copy of that mail is then transferred back to your organization securely and is distributed by individuals within your organization. Now, this is not an automated process. This is something that we offer mainly in these times when there's a difficulty for folks to get access to incoming mail because they're not working in the office that mail was delivered to. So it's a fairly self-contained solution, but in many cases, it is the beginning of the idea of a digital workplace where we would take that scanned mail and enter it into a work process that is then automated and routed efficiently. So from there, we'll step forward into our next component of the digital workplace. And again, as Mike said, any questions that you may have as we're going through this, please enter them into that Q&A tool. And at the end of the presentation, we'll cover as many questions as we possibly can during the time. So, advanced capture, the first step in the digital workplace environment. Advanced capture is how the digital workplace understands the important data within each instance of content and how that data influences the workflow to be instantiated. The content analysis performed during advanced capture allows the digital workplace to support many different work processes without staff having to kick off processes manually. The digital workplace will know that an instance of content is an invoice that needs to follow workflow A, for example, while an employment application entered into the digital workplace needs to follow workflow B. And frankly, that employment application can be just from a document generated from your web page. So we can consume employment applications and have them enter right into a work process within the digital workplace. We also understand in that digital workplace that an ED patient's medical record, for instance, entering that workspace needs to follow a third and completely separate workflow. And remember, even though the digital workplace may be supporting multiple content types and multiple workflows, only those individuals involved in a workflow can access that data and the content that started that workflow process. It's also important to note that a single content instance can actually spawn multiple workflows in the digital workplace if necessary. So if you have a particular content type that comes in and it needs to go to, for instance, the patient accounting department, but also needs to go to finance, that one piece of content entering the digital workplace can spawn both of those workflows, and folks can interact with those documents as needed. As documents, print streams, EDI transactions, or other content enter the digital workplace, that content is analyzed, evaluated, and categorized. Pertinent data elements are captured for use in, one, determining the appropriate workflow to enter. This is how we can have one digital workplace handling multiple content types, multiple document types, and spawning different workflows, specifically from that ability for us to capture information about those documents. Those data elements also typically populate intelligent forms of some sort, and we'll talk about intelligent forms later. It also prepares, and it is prepared for import into existing business systems if necessary. So we could collect a remittance advice, for instance, bring that into the digital workplace, pull data elements out of that remittance advice, and prepare that for import into the patient accounting system, and manage that data transfer automatically. The digital workplace can eliminate or significantly reduce data entry requirements, enhancing the accuracy and speeding processes. Results can be improvements to cash flow or turnaround times. Any manual process can be improved by incorporating it in the digital workplace. We've mentioned automating workflows throughout the presentation so far. Now we'll dig a little bit deeper into this concept. Let's take the example of a work process with which most of us are familiar, expense reporting. Many organizations manage expense reporting and reimbursement with a nicely formatted spreadsheet and the ability to email that spreadsheet around to someone who needs to approve that, and then on to someone who needs to cut a check, typically accounts payable. So that's the idea of a largely manual process. Even though you were doing that with a spreadsheet, with an electronic document, the processing of that activity is still done manually. You still need to address an email to your approver. They still need to review that and approve it, maybe review a separate file of receipts that go along with that expense report, and then forward that, again, typically email, to the accounts payable for that payment. If there's any questions about that expense report, well, we all know what happens. That's a back and forth between the person who submitted it and their approver, that really ends up being an example of a somewhat messy process that probably most of us are familiar with to some extent. So we look at this process now through the lens of what we've learned so far. Is this process automated? No, absolutely not. Is there visibility into the submitted reports? Not really. Once I send that document off, I have no clue if it's sitting in with my manager for approval. I don't know if that person has approved it and moved it on to accounts payable. I don't have any visibility into whether accounts payable has processed it. So I really don't know it's done until I receive a check somewhere down the road. So I have no visibility into this process. Is there accountability? Nope. There's no accountability here because, again, there's no visibility, there's no tracking. We don't know how long that might sit waiting for approval. We don't know how long that might sit in accounts payable waiting to be processed, so on and so forth. Is there policy enforcement to this process? No, not again. There's no way to really enforce policy in this. You're really relying on individuals doing things by policy. It's entirely possible that your policy may say that if the airline ticket, for instance, on your expense report was over $700, then an additional step needs to take place. We have no way to enforce that policy if we're doing these things manually. So we see this work process is ripe for frustration and is not inherently easy for a new employee to adopt effectively, whether that employee is a submitter of expense reports or an approver of expense reports. It's not easy for that new employee to adopt that activity. And how do we ensure that every submitted expense report uses the most current version of the spreadsheet? That's nearly impossible. And folks that are involved in accounts payable, various approvers of expense reporting, all have had examples and knowledge of folks using an older version of a spreadsheet for expense approval. So it's nearly impossible, even though you might put the most current version on your intranet for download and use by employees. Most often folks will save that spreadsheet to their laptop or their PC and use that one over and over again until they're told they're using an older version. So it's impossible to enforce version accuracy in a process that's done manually. And by the way, every employee needs Excel to be able to submit an expense report. So it's not the most cost-effective nature either. But in the digital workplace, this process becomes automated. So instances are managed in work queues, and alerts can be emailed to approvers when a new instance, a new expense report is submitted. And submitters of those expense reports can see where their expense reports are in the process. Anytime you submit a new work process in the digital workplace, you have the ability to call that up and see where that is in the process. So you can see, is it sitting in your approver's work queue waiting for them to approve it? Have they approved it but have a question? If that's the case in the digital workplace, if they're waiting to approve it for you to answer a question, that actually will come back to your queue and you'll get prompted to respond to their questions. And then also, if it's been approved and it's sitting in accounts payable, you can see that as well. And when accounts payable actually begins to cut that check, they might update that record and say, this is in the accounts payable system for a check the week ending, of a particular date. So now you have complete visibility into the process, frustration is removed, but we also have the ability to make sure that everything associated with this new work process adheres to an organization's policies and procedures. The digital workplace can even extract that data from that expense report and send that data to the AP system if a client requires that too. So we can extend this automation all the way into an existing business system right from the digital workplace. Important in the move to the digital workplace is the concept of intelligent forms. Paper forms or office documents get redesigned as intelligent forms within the digital workplace. So a well-designed form supports things like data validation within a field. Is this what we expect to see within this particular field that an individual is entering into? We are also tracking and using design components like a drop-down list for consistent data input, checkboxes and radio buttons to further support existing policies. All of these design influence elements that we build onto our intelligent form have the ability to influence workflows once the intelligence form is submitted into that process. So for instance, we might have a selection there that when I'm entering something, again, we'll go back to that reference where my airfare was greater than $700. Just by entering that information and then submitting the form, that workflow may add a whole new approver to that particular work process automatically, not something I have to remember to do. The system is built to follow those business rules and manage that workflow effectively. That's where we talked about the subtle differences in resulting workflows based on the information that we're gathering. So in the digital workplace, an intelligent form itself is a version of content that drives workflow, that manages processes. So here we see an example of a spreadsheet-based expense report redesigned as an intelligent form. So what are the inherent benefits to this approach? Well, number one, only the current version can be accessed. So if there is only ever one intelligent form that is our expense report, and by the way, we can have multiple expense reports if needed, ones for different individuals in the organization if that's a requirement. But that's always the most current version. If we need to make a change, for instance, to the mileage reimbursement rate, we make that change to the I-form, the intelligent form itself. And then when that form is published, everyone is using that new form, that new update with the current mileage factor in it. So this is an example of what is valuable about intelligent forms versus a spreadsheet-based expense report. The next step, data validation and required fields are enforced. So if I have to have my manager's name or the week ending date in a field, that automatically can be enforced. In other words, when I fail to enter something and I click the submit button, I get a message saying, oh, you have to put in a proper week ending date, for instance. Okay, I forgot to do that. I can enter that information, click submit, and then that form goes off into the process. So we're managing data validation, we're managing required fields. And what's interesting is the form can be accessed from the organization's intranet. So anyone can go on the intranet to the expense report, open up one, begin to fill it out, click submit, and away it goes. So they don't necessarily have to come into a different platform that represents the digital workplace. That existing environment that everyone is familiar with can be integrated and can be an entry point into the digital workplace. Once I begin to fill out a form and I put my name in it, my submitter, or the fact that I am the submitter of this particular expense report, now the digital workplace automatically knows who my approver is. So that's automatically filled in, and that workflow is ready to take place. I don't have to say, this is my manager's name, so on and so forth. So the digital workplace is helping to complete this form based on information that I've already entered. Okay. Another aspect of the intelligent form and the benefits it provides is receipts can be automatically attached to this form. So I can either scan in some receipts, or I can upload a previously scanned receipt or a photograph from my phone, and boom, I can supply the receipts associated with this. The digital workplace can also say, hey, you're getting ready to submit an expense report that requires receipts, and you haven't attached any receipts. So again, we can enforce policy and make the whole process much less frustrating for everyone that uses that new work process within the digital workplace. So now that we've had the ability to create this form, we're data validating, we are making sure we have all required fields completed, we're attaching the receipts to this form, getting ready to submit it. So the processes that are transformed within the digital workplace are entirely self-contained. They're visible, they're trackable, with significant reporting and analytics available to that process. Now, we may not want to do a large amount of analytics around the idea of expense reporting, but that also could be an interesting concept to determine who's, how much we've spent on airfare, for instance. We can report that right out of the digital workplace. We no longer necessarily have to go to our accounts payable or general ledger systems to do that type of reporting. So there's a lot of reporting and analytics available within the digital workspace, providing that's what you want to have out of that particular work process. So now, by incorporating artificial intelligence and machine learning into the digital workplace, we allow for significant variability in a number of things. Incoming content, whether that content is a scanned document, an office file, a print stream, or an interface message. So regardless of the content type, we can apply and leverage artificial intelligence and machine learning to that content as it's brought into the system. Since much of the content may come from outside the organization and we have no control over the format or consistency of that content, for instance, invoices from many different vendors, or physician offices, or physician orders rather, from many different physician practices. So we have that wide variability in content coming into the digital workplace that we really have no control over, okay? So AI and machine learning allow the digital workplace to accept previously unknown formats and still recognize and initiate processes associated with those new formats if desired. Now, in some cases, clients prefer to have anything new or previously unidentified go into a holding queue, for instance, for a human being to inspect. So again, that's an option too, but that's also a component of AI and machine learning to recognize that this is a new document type. I've never seen this before. I'm going to drop it in this holding queue for someone else to take a look at. So there's a lot of different options in how you deploy the components and functionality around the digital workplace. So AI and machine learning are also used for deep and accurate analysis of large blocks of text, which prior to the advent of the digital workplace were unavailable to automated processes. We now employ these tools to massively increase the availability of certain content in the digital workplace. An example of this, computer-aided coding, for instance. The use of AI and machine learning in that digital workplace of computer-aided coding. So later in the presentation, we'll discuss some specific examples where we have implemented these tools in delivering client projects. So we've hinted at the value of analytics throughout this session. Now we can explain in more detail our vision of analytics in the digital workplace. And analytics come in different flavors and often mean different things to different people. Analytics are involved in both reporting, report generation, and the graphical dashboards that senior leadership is so much more interested in. And they have unique uses for each. Okay, some uses are more inherently interesting in the dashboard environment, where others may prefer to have, for instance, if you're going to do an employee review and you want a report to show their productivity over the past 30 days or 60 days, 90 days, whatever, you would want that done in a report rather than a graphical display typically. Analytics can act on just a single instance of a work process by alerting staff to unusual data elements or an unusual process step, and can initiate a unique workflow when this occurs. And we call this actionable analytics. So in that instance where I mentioned we have some previously unknown content that enters into the digital workplace, that content gets analyzed with the assistance of machine learning and artificial intelligence. But then the analytics says, okay, this isn't something we've seen before. We're going to drop this into the holding queue, and I'm going to fire off an email alert to the individual responsible for reviewing that holding queue. So analytics at the most detailed level has a step in that whole process. So we talked about analytics on a single instance. When we talk about aggregated analytics, this is, whether this is a report or dashboard-based analytics delivery, the aggregated analytics act upon many instances of a single work process over a time period and can provide unique operational insight into business processes, staff productivity, or comparison to peers that are participating in that same business process. And this was nearly impossible to accomplish before that process was transformed into the digital workplace. So for instance, if we are consuming physician records and determining, we're consuming patient records and we're determining the number of records that were submitted in a complete state and the number of records that were submitted but had some sort of problem with them, maybe a missing history and physical or a discharge summary that wasn't signed. We can take a look, and analytics can tell us, by an individual physician, whether one physician is, drastically less performing in providing complete records than their peers are. So analytics can give us that insight, not only to staff level employees, but mid-level management, senior management, and physicians as well. So we all know that conversations with folks are better supported by hard numbers. And the idea of this analytics out of the digital workplace provides those types of hard numbers. So performance improvement initiatives are inherently supported by analytics within the digital workplace. We began that conversation. Staff mentoring using analytics bring real world performance metrics into discussions with staff, again, whether they're entry level, mid-level managers, physicians themselves, and it's hard to argue with concrete numbers. So if you remember very, very back early in the process, I mentioned that the digital workplace needs to have an understanding of key performance indicators that we want associated with a particular process. And this is why the digital workplace needs to understand what your KPIs are, because then we can build analytics around tracking that and reporting those key performance indicators. So, in review, the digital workplace delivers routine gains in efficiency and effectiveness of previously manual, frequently occurring work processes. You don't want to take a process that is done, 1 or 2 instances a month and spend the effort to get that into the digital workplace. Where the digital workplace gives you the most benefit is where you're doing many, many instances of this same process on a daily, weekly, or monthly basis, okay? So to call this back into a frame of reference, you have a manual process, and by manual process, I even mean the idea of completing an electronic document and emailing that around your organization. So that's the left-hand side, the current process. It's manually accomplished. It's often very slow because we're not automating any activity. We're not tracking any activity. The system is not prompting users to complete activity. It's inefficient and there's no visibility into it. So again, that type of a process done over and over again is just ripe for frustration amongst users and staff involved in that process. And that's whether that staff are entry-level folks or mid-level managers to senior management. And then the idea that you don't have any visibility into that process is often very frustrating to executive management or board members, frankly. So this idea of taking these manual processes that are done many, many times a day, a week, and driving them to the digital workplace and gaining those daily gains in efficiency to facilitate that automation, to make that process faster, to make it more efficient, and to give all the participants in that activity visibility into where we are in the process for all of these instances. So that's a review of the idea of the digital workplace. Now let's just take a look at how GRM delivers the digital workplace. GRM's Enterprise Content Services platform, which we call Visual Vault, is an entirely web-based environment delivered as a SaaS model hosted at Amazon Web Services. It's a multi-tenant architecture composed of groups of microservices, or those groups which you see here. Individual microservices are spawned for each instance of a process, making exceptionally efficient use of AWS resources and ensuring excellent performance for our clients. And you can see that our microservices groups largely conform to those required to deliver the digital workplace. It's important to note that this platform is comprised of a single integrated tool set and not a commingled set of third-party products. This is all delivered within one coherent platform. Next, we'll review 2 specific client solutions which deliver the digital workplace in very different circumstances. Here's a GRM client study of an organization focused on delivering contract physician services to more than 1,200 hospitals across the country. Their lines of business include emergency department physicians, hospitalists, and anesthesiologists. The process of collecting medical records from 1,200 client hospitals with widely varied EMRs and widely varying technological capabilities was a daunting task for this particular client. Our implementation of the digital workplace allowed them to reduce their time to obtain a complete patient chart across these 3 lines of business from what was on average 21 days to on average 7 days. This yielded massive operational benefits that we see here. So we've solved a dramatic cash flow issue for this organization whose revenues amassed more than $15 billion a year. We improved their day sales outstanding by 65% and reduced their timely filing denials by 70%. Okay, so basically what we did is we initiated the digital workplace environment for them to capture patient charts from all of their hospital clients, 1,200 different hospitals. Our chart analysis engine, combined with AI and machine learning, was working to determine whether a chart was complete. If it was complete, that would go through workflow and end up in a coder queue so that it could code that chart. If it was incomplete for any reason, again, a missing history and physical or an unsigned discharge summary, then workflow would drive that information back to the submitter of that chart and identify specifically what was missing in that chart and why it was deemed incomplete. We use machine learning, we use artificial intelligence here as well as the basic configurability of our chart analysis engine, because very often a client might go through an EMR upgrade, which would significantly change the formatting of their chart, okay? And by that point now, the chart was so different that our ingrained chart analysis would not be able to determine exactly who this was coming from, exactly what type of chart this was, and whether it was complete or not. We would use machine learning and artificial intelligence to help drive that to a more effective completion. But at the same time we did that, our analytics engine would fire off an alert that says, hey, this particular client, General Hospital in Arizona, has changed their chart format significantly, and someone needs to take a look at it so that we can reconfigure and not drop this chart to an artificial intelligence process over and over and over again. So we'd flag that chart. They'd be able to identify what the changes were. We then instantiate those changes within our chart analysis engine and allow that process, again, to go through the more streamlined workflow process to determine its completion. And again, ultimately, this meant higher reimbursement, faster reimbursement, improved cash flow for this client. Our next instance is the idea of an organization with more than 250 physician practices across the country, centralizing coding into one location here in Nashville, Tennessee. That centralized coding situation for them was very manual, very email intensive. There was a lot of finger pointing back and forth about incomplete charts and, the typical thing, well, we sent that component of the chart, you must have lost it, so on and so forth. So a massively frustrating process for the submission of charts so that they could be coded. So we stepped in, we got involved in this. Again, we implemented the digital workplace for them using a coding workflow process. And the resulting situation was we reduced their coding backlog by up to 80% and reduced their cost of having outsourced coders brought in by 40%. So their backlog was so big that they would have to bring in outsourced coders to work that backlog down. So by reducing that backlog, they reduced their reliance on coding outsourcing, and were able to get that whole process done much more efficiently. So again, here are the broad components of the digital workplace that are leveraged to deliver efficiency, visibility, accountability, and unique business insight with analytics into important work processes in your organizations. At this point, Mike, I'll open it up for any questions.
Yep, thank you, Jim. Let's see here. All right, Jim, as you can see, just two questions it looks like have come in during the course of the webinar. So let me read those just for the benefit of the audience. So the first one, how long does implementation typically take to make a manual process a fully automated process, such as processing expense reports?
Okay, that drastically depends on the complexity of the process itself. Expense reports is a pretty cut and dried process. That's implemented in a matter of weeks, 2 to 3. You get something much more detailed, like one of those solutions, the projects that we just ran through. Those are very, very detailed projects that can take months to implement. So it really depends on the complexity of the work process that we're transforming into the digital workplace.
Got it. All right, and then one other one here. Many of our employees are working from home currently. Would GRM help us organize and conduct a remote group training on new technologies that are implemented?
Oh, sure. Routinely, when we do a work process in the digital workplace, that work process likely involves people that are dispersed over a large geographic area, sometimes across the entire United States. In the case of that organization that did contract positions, they had offices in Philadelphia, they had offices in Florida, Dallas, Texas, on the West Coast. So routinely, we design our training initiatives to be delivered in a webinar fashion, that we can walk people through the process, the I-forms that are involved. We show them their work queues, that type of thing. So routinely, we deliver training via webinars. And certainly if a client has a very concentrated number of employees that need to be trained and they'd like to do on-site training, well, we do that as well. But by and large, most of our training is done via the webinar.
Got it. All right. Thank you, Jim. Those were the couple of questions that were submitted, and we are coming up here pretty close to an hour. So I think we will end things there. So I'd like to say to everybody on the phone, thank you again for joining us, and have a very good day.
Thanks much, folks.